Good afternoon and welcome to all of you, including those of you who are standing in the back. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Suzanne Maloney and I'm Deputy Director of the Foreign Policy Program here at the Brookings Institution. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all here today for our event on the tribes of Israel, diversity, cohesion, and conflict. This event is the conclusion of a two-day workshop with participants from Israel and the United States, convened by the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. The starting point for this gathering was a speech by President Reuven Rivlin of Israel, including his remarks here at Brookings last year, where he described Israel as a society that no longer has one dominant identity group, secular Jews, but rather has 4 tribes of similar size. President Rivlin went further and suggested that a new compact should be forged among Israel's tribes based on respect for each group's separate approach to governing society. Others have argued that identity politics should not be institutionalized in such a way, that Israeli society should not give up on a common cause that crosses community lines and can be shared by Israelis of all stripes, Jews and Arabs, religious and secular. What is the appropriate role of identity politics in Israel and elsewhere? How can the tribes of Israel create a better society? What might this teach us both about the future of Israeli foreign policy and about American society and politics? These are among the themes we will explore today. This program continues with our project on imagining Israel's future, which brings the dynamics of Israeli society to audiences in Washington. We are grateful to the Morningstar Foundation for its generous support of this project. As always, Brookings maintains strict independence in its research, and the views expressed here today and elsewhere are only those of the individual authors and speakers. Our event today is a special 2-panel event. The first panel deals with the broad visions of Israel's future, a self-defined Jewish democratic state with a large minority that is not Jewish, as well as strong differences among the Jewish majority. The second panel will dive into issues of religion and state in a country that has no official separation between the two, and where these issues are hotly debated every day. One more point of order. For those of you who tweet, you can, and we encourage you to use the hashtag #Israel'sFuture. I'd like to now turn the floor over to Natan Sachs, fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings, who convened this workshop and this important event today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure for all of us. And I want to thank the participants in this workshop. It's been a long and very interesting 2 days, including the people you're going to see on the stage today in both panels. Suzanne mentioned the speech that President Rivlin gave. He gave it actually in this very room. It wasn't the first place he gave it, but we like to pretend it was. And he spoke about the 4 tribes of Israel. It was a very sobering assessment of a reality in Israel today. In particular, if you look at the educational system in Israel, there are 4 streams, quite separate. Some of them will not meet later in life. They will not necessarily meet in the military, which secular Israelis and national religious Israelis serve in. They will sometimes not meet in the workforce. Some of these educational systems are in different languages and have very different curriculums. The Arab Israelis, of course, their educational system is in Arabic, a state-funded educational system. Secular Jewish Israelis, traditionally the hegemonic group of Israeli society, but no longer so. National religious have a different curriculum and a different conception of Zionism, the sort of ordering ideology of the early state. And ultra-Orthodox, or Haredi in Israeli parlance, who have a very strict view of religion and reject Zionism, at least officially. So how do they meet? President Rivlin, as Suzanne mentioned, had suggested that there should be a compact among these groups, that Israel should recognize this reality of no longer having a single majority, no longer aspiring to have one ordering cause for the state, and rather recognize it as a diverse society. This may sound familiar from other places as well. But the criticism that Suzanne alluded to is very real too. You may have read in the New York Times, just since this last election, a call for people in the United States to set aside the politics of identity. A call to think that identity politics, the basis of asking for respect, asking for recognition of individuals and groups among society, can shadow or crowd out other political causes, in particular economic causes. This from the left. From the right, of course, we heard the presidential candidate, now president-elect, talking about political correctness, very derogatorily, which in many cases was exactly a call for respect for groups and minority. This, in no small part, is a challenge to a very basic philosophical question in the United States. The United States, in particular, is based on individualistic liberalism, on the idea that individuals have rights, inalienable rights, and that society should be constructed considering these individuals, and that the state has a direct relationship with that individual. The National Guard might go and help one girl go into school simply because she has that individual right. This conception that President Rivlin suggested for Israel, and that others have suggested elsewhere, goes against this. It views groups as an important component of society, as something that deserves respect, deserves perhaps institutionalization in government policy. Not just that girls should be respected, but the group she belonged to. In that case, African Americans should be respected as a group, their leadership, their traditions. In Israel, this means that individuals, a girl in the ultra-Orthodox society, for example, who may not receive education that allows her full potential in life in some views, might still be going to the same educational system out of respect for that group's authority over its own education. Here ends my preface. I'm very delighted to have 4 people for this first panel. We have a fascinating panel following us, moderated by Leon Wieseltier. In this panel, just to my left, is MK Stav Shafir, member of Knesset, the Israeli parliament. Toda. Stav Shafir is from the Labour Party and the Zionist Union List. She heads a transparency committee in the Knesset and is a member of the Finance Committee, where she has had many a battle with the coalition. She was also one of the central leaders of the giant social protests in 2011 that catapulted her into national fame. To her left is Mohammed Araushe. He's the co-executive director of the Center for Shared Society at Givat Chaviva in Israel. He is a very well-known figure in programs for shared society in Israel. Speaks very frequently here in the United States. I'm sure many of you have heard him speak eloquently before. And he's really one of the leading voices for shared society, not merely for coexistence, but for a deeper understanding of what a shared society might mean in Israel. And we're delighted that they made the way all the way to the United States to be with us. To his left is my colleague, my esteemed colleague, Shilby Terhami. He's professor of the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. He's the Anwar Sadat Chair. And he is, he's one to the left of that. Sorry about that. He is also a non-resident fellow with us at the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. He has done excellent and long-time polling studies of both the United States attitudes across the Middle East and inside Israel. Just recently launched some fascinating polling on American attitudes towards the Middle East. He's working on a book which I'm eagerly awaiting on evangelical attitudes in the United States, and he will have with us some data, just a taste of new data he has on Arab-Israeli attitudes and attitudes towards them in Israel. And to his right is Yehuda Mirsky, who also made the trip down from Boston. He's professor of Near East and Judaic Studies at Brandeis University. He's also no stranger to Washington. He's a former State Department official and a staffer on the Hill for some very central figures. He's also the author of a fascinating book, Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution, from 2014, Yale University Press, which I highly recommend. Here ends the introductions. Stav MK Shafir, why don't I turn to you first? Your work in the Knesset is focused very strongly on questions of funding, questions of transparency, questions that transcend groups. Although you yourself obviously come from a certain segment of the population in Israel, as anyone would, your work has emphasized very much what some people would call the older attitudes of progressives or left, not so much questions of identity. In the social protest movements, which you were one of the leaders of, the words, in fact, the names for certain groups were not even mentioned. You talked about social justice, about wages, about cost of living. Am I right to assume you disagree with President Rivlin? What's your attitude on President Rivlin's approach for a communal compact in Israel?
Thank you, Nathan. Well, it's a very interesting question. Many people would like to see the Israeli public divided into these 4 tribes, maybe even 10 tribes or 100 tribes. Are we really divided to these specific tribes? As a as a half Mizrahi, as half Ashkenazi, I would say, well, I don't know if I'm divided between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi identities. My origins are Iraqi and Polish and Romanian, and two of my grandparents were actually born in Israel and built it with their bare hands. As a secular Jew who is secular, but at the same time fast on Yom Kippur and eat kosher, I don't know, am I divided between these two categories? No, not so much. I feel quite natural about it. I think the young generation in Israel is much less dogmatic in its identity spectrum, you would say. Who is served by this sectarian or tribal division? It's serving politicians today much more than it serves the people. Our political system is extremely divided. We all can share much more in common, but once we go to vote, we would have our very strict tribal voting patterns. Our political system is not only encouraged and maintains its power with that division, it manifests itself and actually gets us into that vicious cycle that's almost impossible to get out of. It serves politicians from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who uses these differences in our society many times as manipulation to insert fear and use fear and hatred in order to empower those who are in government and remove an ability for a change. It serves also the people on the joint list, who are gaining much power by that division and that need of the Arab society to vote for a very specific party rather than choosing other voting possibilities. It serves the ultra-Orthodox parties. It serves almost all the different parties. It definitely doesn't serve the people. If you see, I can give you thousands of different examples from the ultra-Orthodox parties, where today the younger generation is much more pro-integration, much more willing to get connected to technology, to the internet, to the great possibilities that there are outside, and their political leadership that's trying to keep them inside. It goes for the revolution that we see today amongst religious women, from what we call the tribe of national religious, the traditional religion, or not the ultra-Orthodox, where many of the women, today there's a big discussion in Israel over military service. Young women, religious women have today, for many years since the very beginning, they don't have to go to the military like secular women have to. Many young religious women really want to go to the military, but they're pushed by their own politicians, by their own leadership, to not do so, and they're threatened when they try to do so. So is it really serving the people? Our education system is divided into 4 different parts. They are financed differently. The state budget is divided unfairly between these different education systems. Very much depends on their politicians. Is this fair for our society, that our society has a chance to make a progress if we keep such enormous economic gaps between us? I mean, we all know today that the biggest economic threat to Israel is unemployment and lack of participation in the market by Arab and ultra-Orthodox societies. This is a problem that we all share. It's not like parts of the society can get better while half of the society is getting poorer and poorer. It's going to affect all of us. So does it make any sense to keep the tribal division in our education system and keep a different budget to each education system? Keep the, in our case, the religious schools get the highest budget. The secular schools, what we call the Chinuch Mamlechti, is getting the medium-range budget, and the Arab sector is getting, and the ultra-Orthodox sector are getting a poorer budget. Is this going to get us a safe society? Not so much. That division doesn't serve Israel. We saw what people actually want. We saw it 5 years ago in the protest movement. In 2011, 10% of the Israeli society went to the street to protest for social justice. It was called here the cottage cheese protest. So let me tell you that it was not about cheese. And it was later called the housing crisis, protest. That was really maybe the first incentive. But the protest was not about housing as well. The fact that 1 million people went to the street to protest was not just the housing crisis. It was the crisis with our home and what Israel is supposed to be, what happened to our home. Because Israel was built upon foundations that we're so proud of. It was built by our grandparents, who were the most courageous people that I can possibly imagine, who made the impossible possible. They built something that nobody believed that could happen. And they built it because they were extremely pragmatic and extremely courageous. And they didn't look at problems and then just said, okay, well, there are problems, so we'll stop, or we wait for somebody to save us, as today we're encouraged to think politically. Let's just wait. Let's maintain the status quo and wait for something. No, the essence of Zionism is the very opposite. We're not waiting for anybody to save us. We're solving our problems. We're taking destiny in our own hands. That's what my generation is so much missing in our political system today. We grew up after almost 40 years straight of Likud right-wing governments, we grew up into a political system that trains us to think that the best goal that we can achieve is to maintain the status quo. It's a political decision. It's a political system that's unable to make decisions on the core issues that Israel has to confront. The first one would be the conflict, our borders, that every day that we're not making a decision is risking Israel's future as a safe home for the Jewish people and a democracy that's fair and equal to all of its citizens. It's a political system that for decades hasn't made a decision on the relationship between state and religion, between state and synagogue, you may call it, and who rules. And it's a political decision that for a very long time hasn't made up its mind on our economic issues. If you look at every poll in Israel, you see, and you ask people for their stands on issues, not for whether they're right or left. The words right and left today in Israel, they don't mean much. They were corrupt by politicians who removed every sense of meaning from these words. When you ask people what they believe in, if they believe in that every child deserves a fair education, if they believe that we need to work harder to make sure that healthcare is given to everybody, regardless of where they come from, and if you ask them what they believe, what's their answer about the conflict, if they're pro a two-state solution, or if they want the greater Israel, which means that we may lose the whole thing because Israel would have to choose between keeping its Jewish character and identity to maintaining its democracy. When you ask people about all of these issues, you see between 60 to 75% on the progressive side, on each one of these issues. When you look at how people elect in the elections, I guess what you're now thinking is, wait, but people chose the right, they chose Netanyahu. Well, if you actually count the seats, you see a different picture. You see a right-wing camp with about 40 seats, and you see a progressive camp with relatively the same amount of seats, even slightly more seats. However, while the right is going to election very much united in one or two different parties, the left, the progressive camp, the democratic camp, is going to election extremely divided. Something between 3 to 5, even 6 different parties. With that division in a coalition-based parliament, there's just no chance of winning. This is a betrayal in our voters. The lack of ability to unite behind these very basic questions of our borders, of religion and state, of our economy, and answer where our voters know what they want, and they vote for us to achieve these things. The lack of ability to do that ego-based political decisions, rather than decisions that are based on what's really good for our country, and what's really good for our country is to make a very dramatic change and make decisions over all of these issues that I mentioned and make what the Israeli people want, as long as we don't do that, that's a failure. That's an extreme leadership failure. What are the reasons? As we all know well, the reasons are that each one of the leaders think that it's all about him rather than about anything else. As long as this continues, we will continue to fail. What we need is to put a very clear line. Those who are pro-two-state solution has to go together for the next election. We can have a primary election for the leadership of that camp. The people will choose who needs to lead it, but they have to go together. It's the same camp of people who are pro-civil marriage, the same camp that believes that we need to separate religion and state, that we need to allow people freedom to experience Judaism and all the other religions that exist in the way that they find and they want to experience. It's the same camp that is pro a more humane economy and a more strategic thinking about these basic economic questions that I stated in the beginning. And that camp has to go together. And if it goes together, it will win. That's definite. These are the numbers. So just to end this, I think if there's one conclusion that I got from the protest movement and that brought me into politics after the protest, is that most of the Israeli society actually wants to live together. It understands that heterogeneity doesn't have to be an obstacle. It can be an advantage. We can use it for the best of our country. We can use it to achieve better economy, to achieve better goals, to be a much happier society. When we celebrate our heterogeneity, we enjoy it so much. There's so much to learn and to gain from each other. The more that our political system sees it as an obstacle, the more that we're divided, and the more that our politics is based on fear politics rather than strategical and hopeful thinking about our future and pragmatic thinking about how we solve our problems, Israel puts itself at danger. If we want to see a future for the country that we love so much, we have to start and we've been strategic about our camp as well, uniting the different parts of the camp, putting that line between the choices that Israel has to make, and reminding and showing voters that politics of hope is possible, that these tribes should not be looked at dogmatically, but should be looked at productively, should be looked at as a source of strength that you can all use for a much better future.
Thank you very much. I'd like now to turn to Shibli, and actually there's some data that we're going to put up. Shibli, we hear here a hopeful vision of what Israel might be and how heterogeneity might work. But I wonder, in your data and your analysis and very long-term view of society in Israel, what is the actual reality today, relations in particular between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis? How do they view each other? How do they view their situation? Is there room for hope, or is the view actually more pessimistic?
Thanks, Natan. Allow me to speak from here because I just want to explain this graph. Good afternoon. Natan, thank you for putting this together. It's a great event, and a lot of thinking went into it. So many of you know that I do a lot of public opinion polling, not just in the U.S., but also in the Middle East, in the Arab world, as well as Israel, and some among Israeli Jews, some among Arab citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel. And what I want to show you today is just one slide. I'm not going to talk about it much, just to frame a conversation that I want to have. This is a poll that I just did in October among Palestinian citizens of Israel. And by the way, I go between Palestinian citizens and Arab citizens because some consider themselves Arab first, some consider themselves Palestinian first. And I want to just use that as a way of engaging you on what the status is and the way I think about it. One of the questions I asked, look at that upper left corner, I asked Arab citizens which factor is most important in preventing stronger identification with Israeli citizenship. So you could see here that by far the number one answer is continued Israeli occupation. Now, notice that, of course, the others are important too, and I could tell you that in looking at that data, this is not just one question I asked. I asked this question, but I asked each one of these factors, asked them to evaluate how important that factor is. They're all somewhat important, but this is number one, even when you ask the intensity on every single one of those questions. Now, another question, if you look at the upper right, sort of which priority should be Arab citizens' priority? Seek equality in the state of Israel, seek a just resolution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, or both equally. And you can see that essentially they don't want to choose. They want both equally. Obviously, just a marginal difference between seeking full equality and seeking a resolution by itself. But you've got 69% say seek both equally. Now, I want to say something about that because I think obviously this is, despite the progress at some level of being incorporated, and maybe Mohammed could talk about that particularly in terms of maybe a new opening of acceptance of citizenship among Arab citizens. This issue remains hugely consequential, and it's consequential not just theoretically. Let me just say that if you analyze even the demographics of Palestinian citizens of Israel, half of them have relatives who became refugees in 48. Half of them. Okay, so just, this is like families. We're not just talking about identity in a broad, abstract sense. It's very practical. And more important, I would say, particularly in this current environment, it used to be where you can have an Arab and a Jewish citizen working together in an office or a factory, and then there's intense conflict. Intense conflict, it takes place in Gaza, like the Gaza war, or you have stabbings, or you have Israeli, demolitions, things that are emotional, things that, get to the bottom of the feelings of both Arabs and Jews. And it used to be where people kept their feelings to themselves. They went back at home and they talked about them in their bedrooms and living rooms, and it didn't really come out. I mean, particularly, they might have opinion that they express, but the deepest, most threatening feelings were kept private. That's no longer the case because of the social media. So social media, obviously people have Facebooks and Twitter accounts, and people wear their feelings on their sleeves, certainly on the internet. And people sitting next to each other can see it. And you can talk to people who have Arab and Jewish workers, how this is tough to manage, particularly when there is a crisis, an outbreak taking place. So there is, this is obviously a hugely important issue that's not going away. The second point I want to make from these graphs is that if you look at the prioritizing of the other issues, it's interesting that Arab citizens see the attitudes of Israel's Jewish citizens toward them to be more of a barrier even than official state policy or even the Jewishness of Israel as such. And that, by the way, of course, as I said, all these are important when you measure them individually, but they're ranked this way. And that's really important and interesting, and it's something that needs to be reflected upon. And I think in and of itself, it is somewhat expressed in the graphs that are at the bottom of this graphic, the page. This is taken from a very large Pew poll taken in Israel. And I want to look at the two findings that have been talked about. One is how many Israelis agree that Arabs should be expelled from Israel. Now, you could see the numbers, over 45%, and those who are under 50, 49%. It's actually growing a little bit harsher, and we see that actually the trend in Israel, up to a point even among Arab citizens as well, is hardening of positions, not liberal, unlike what we have here in the U.S., where we have more liberalizing of position among the youth in Israel and among Jews and Arabs. You actually have a hardening of positions, and there are a lot, we could discuss why that's the case, but there's no question that that's the trend that we see. So look at that number. And no matter, the people who raised the question about was this asked, did they think it was maybe the West Bank? I mean, I looked at the data that Pew did. I think it's clear about Israel, but even if it were about the West Bank as well, when you're saying, half Israelis want to expel them, think about where you find yourself as an Arab citizen in Israel. If you also look at the other graphic at the bottom right, which I think is in some ways more telling, because I think the expression, we all know that these feelings about expulsion or on the Palestinian side of acts of violence, they're dynamic. So in the middle of intense conflict, you have more hardening of positions. In the early 1990s, after Oslo, we had softening of position. We know this is dynamic, this is interactive, it's not. But what's fascinating here is that, to me, this one is a little bit more telling. So the question is, do Jews deserve preferential treatment in Israel? And you have the overwhelming majority who say yes, roughly 80% across the board. And that's extraordinary, because this is separate from the right of return. That's something that is asked separately within the state. And I say that's something that is subtle, but it is certainly picked up in the nature of relations between Arabs and Jews. Now, I want to say one more point about that, and that is that one of the things that I have been reflecting on, I've been reflecting on this conflict for a long time, broadly, not just citizenship within Israel itself. As you could see, the Palestine question is not just about the Palestine question, it's also about citizenship, because it has consequences for citizenship. No matter what happens to people on the West Bank and Gaza, it has that consequence. But I have always was in the late 1990s, and certainly after the collapse of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in 2000, I wrote warning that we're losing the nationalistic framing of the conflict into increasing religious discourse of the conflict. And I found that religious discourse to become far more threatening to reconciliation. There's nothing wrong with religion or religious discourse, but religious discourse as a basis for resolution of the conflict is highly problematic. And so what we find, and I hope maybe this will come up later on in the next panel on secularism, where even secularists, I believe, people who really wanted a secular society, made a strategic mistake by deferring the legitimizing language to the religious authorities in some ways, by essentially framing why it is they want to do X, Y, Z, like holding on to Jerusalem, or why it is that you would call it not the West Bank but Judea and Samaria. That when you are using religious symbols and language to legitimize even moderate positions, just like you would in the Arab world, where people using Islam and a kind of a more benign interpretation of Islam to fight extremists. You are giving the extremist the legitimizing tool. A secularist is not going to win the religious argument with the most religious authorities. They simply are not. And by appealing to those arguments, you are empowering them, and you don't have a counter when, in fact, you then have a narrative that emerges that's based on that. It is very hard to pull back away from it. And I see that even in the framing of why it is that Israel needs to make peace, because, quote, it is going to cease to be a Jewish and democratic state. And we talk about it in terms of what? Quote, the demographic problem. And, okay, I mean, if you are talking internally within the Jewish community of Israel, that is reasonable to talk about, because you talk about the character of how you envision it. If you're talking about it as a reason for a settlement, essentially you're positing the Arabs as a problem. And you are the basis for a solution has to always be some measure that sits outside of each community, like international law, human rights, appeal to UN resolutions, because that has always been the basis for these resolutions. So I am worried that we have had the infusion of religious legitimation even among those who secular on matters related on both sides. I'm just here focused on the Israel side, on both sides, in a way that makes it harder even to be clear. There's nothing wrong with people who, in their faith, claim the right to access to holy places. Nothing wrong with it. If a Jew sees Nablus as being extremely important in the holy book, or that they have reason to, should have the right to it. But we need to separate that from claims of property rights, claims of sovereignty, claims of so we have infused that discourse into the discourse about legality and conflict resolution in a way that has really become complicated, and it sure is complicated in the domestic context. By the way, just for measure, when Obama came to office, I was one of a few people, I think my colleague here was also one of the group of people who was there talking about the Cairo speech. We helped give ideas about what the president should do in the Cairo speech. And one of the points I made is don't put too much religious language in the speech. It was full of references to President Obama, a secular Christian president of a country that's not trusted, is trying to tell people what they should do because of his own interpretation of what the Quran says. And imagine if he's going to compete with those on the street who think they know the Quran far better than him. He's just giving them, he's appealing to the wrong legitimizing. By the way, my advice was not taken. It was only marginally taken. It was like reduced by some amount, but not, which is like what the Obama administration has done over and over again, cut it by half or cut it by a third or whatever, as if that solves the problem, but that was the case. So one final point I want to make on this. This issue of, this issue in some ways goes beyond the Jewishness of Israel per se, because if you look at that quadrant, at that top upper left, you see that the Jewishness of Israel is only one, and actually more worried about the actual policies and behavior. So the Jewishness of Israel is an issue for Arabs, but it's not. There are things that are behavioral that are even more consequential, and this goes to it. But one bottom line in the American polls, so I do also polling here in the U.S. About how Americans feel about the question of Israel-Palestine. And one of the things I've been looking at is, what if there's no two-state solution and Israel is faced with a choice to be either a Jewish state without full equal rights for Arabs, or to be a fully democratic state and ceases to be a Jewish state? What would you support, meaning the American public? What would you embrace if that were the choice? And the large majority say they prefer democracy over Jewishness, even spelled out as I just spelled it out. And that seems to hold, certainly among Democrats, especially among Democrats, overwhelming majority of Democrats, but also among Republicans, and also among independents, and especially among young Americans, and even slight majority among the evangelicals. So it's a big issue. It's one I hope that we'll talk about more.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, we're probably going to do just one round and open it up for questions since we have a second panel. But we have a bit of time before that. Mohammed, I'd like to turn to you with two questions. First, your reaction to these quite striking and quite troubling data that we just saw from Shipley. And the reality seems bleak in terms of coexistence among these groups. But you work on this every single day. Is there good news to be had as well? Are there things that we're not seeing outside of the narrative realm that give you some hope in terms of the condition of the Arab minority in Israel or relations between Arabs and Jews?
Thank you, Nathan. Before I start talking about the good news, let me even tell you how bad it is. Because I think that what was presented is not even bad enough. To be in the receiving end of discrimination on a daily basis as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, it's not fun and it's not pleasant to be a Palestinian minority in Israel. You are not only reminded of a separate identity, but you're even punished of being of different identity, often seen as an extension of the Palestinian enemy and not as legitimate citizens. And over the last 15 years, the political discourse has become much more, I would say, even darker, worse, nationalistic in Jewish terms, that almost leaves no space for legitimacy of non-Jewish citizens in Israel, and specifically for the Arab citizenship in Israel. The concept of legitimacy for the Arab citizens in Israel is obviously at question. You saw it from the 2 points that were the 2 questions there. Half of Israeli Jewish population is willing to accept expulsion, ethnic cleansing of Arab citizens. I mean, that's a reality. It means putting us on trucks and dropping us on the borders. That's half of the population is willing to accept that. Until almost 2001, every time there was a discussion about Israel's tension between its Jewish and democratic nature, and people went to court with that, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of democratic over Jewish, that the democratic nature is much more important than the Jewish nature. In the last, specifically 10 years, and with the backing of right-wing governments in Israel, every time there's contradiction between Jewish and democratic, the Jewish triumphs over democratic on the expense of the legitimacy or certain political freedoms or often social economic rights of Arab citizens in Israel. And this is even getting stronger and much more wider under this government, under Netanyahu's government in the last 7 years. More than 30 laws were passed that shrink the democratic nature of Israel for Arab citizens. Israel is behaving more and more as Jewish towards the Arabs and democratic towards the Jews. It reminds us that this is not our state. Well, which is my state? I didn't immigrate to Israel. Israel immigrated to me. I didn't choose this citizenship. It was forced on us, and there was a promise with that kind of thing, the promise of the Declaration of Independence that said social, economic, and political equality. That's the promise. That's the promise according to which we accepted Israeli citizenship, and that was the promise of the founding fathers of the State of Israel. Some people are trying to steal that promise, to steal the promise of the founding fathers, and to create not the State of Israel, but the State of Judea, where they relate to Arab citizens as non-legitimate gerim, or foreigners that live in the Jewish state. Well, I'm not a foreigner. That's my homeland. I have no problem sharing this homeland with the Jewish people, but I'm not willing to accept a second-class status as 89% of the Israeli Jews want. Preferential treatment, that's second-class status. I'm not willing to accept a second-class status. Now, the question is, where can we actually find ways to have a discussion about that constitutional image and shape of Israel that helps it to mature to become not just the state of the Jewish people, but also the state of its citizens? I don't think Israel can allow itself not to be the state of its citizens, but I also, speaking in historic terms, I don't think Israel can also allow itself not to be the homeland of the Jewish people. This is a combination that has to be combined together, and until now, Israel doesn't know how to live this dual identity, which has been present in the Declaration of Independence since 1948, but no one actually took real care of it. And that means, how can Israel become Israeli? You know, most people are saying, is Israel Jewish or democratic state? Well, first of all, become an Israeli state. An Israeli state means it has to be an inclusive state, inclusive to all of the different groups, whether you call them tribes or you call them ethnic identities. I prefer that the Palestinian citizens of Israel be granted a national minority status, which recognizes the unique identity. I do not want to be a tribe that melts in the melting pot of Israeli society. And we have unique identity that needs to be protected and preserved, that lives in good relations with the Israeli society. And when we talk about good relations, and I'm trying to answer the second point of the second question you asked, about certain good news that might come out of this. there are two levels of discussion. There's the constitutional discourse about the identity of the state and whether we will have a constitution that will be an inclusive constitution, a democratic constitution, pluralistic constitution, versus accumulating successes on the ground. And in the past, accumulating those successes was called coexistence. Let's create good coexistence between Jewish and Arab children in Israel. And that was a mistake, in my view. One, to use the term coexistence, and second, to put the burden on children. That we excuse ourselves as adults from the responsibility of finding solutions, and we put it in the burden on the shoulders of children, so that in 1 or 2 generations they'll figure out a solution. My problem with the term coexistence is also that it can tolerate the principle of coexistence between a horse and a rider, where the paradox of hierarchy is so dominant. And I definitely do not want to be the horse in this formula. As long as as long as the coexistence was about Jews and Arabs coming for a temporary encounter where they eat hummus together and we listen to music and then we go home to our segregated and unequal reality. And that's what most Israeli society was trying, and many organizations were trying to accommodate this concept of coexistence. And when I rejoined my center, Givat Haviva, they asked me to choose a title for my job there. And I said, I want to use the title of shared society. And they said, why not coexistence? I said, because I have this problem with this paradox of hierarchy, that Jewish-Arab relations are not about good relations. It's not about pleasant encounters. We have additional elements that need to be in this relationship. And the additional elements that move us from the concept of coexistence to shared society include, 1, a narrative debate. Let's talk about the problems and not only about the niceties. Let's be honest about the problems. Let's talk about my problem with some of the symbols, such as the national anthem and the flag, who do not represent my identity. I have nothing against Jewish soul, but I don't have one. And I probably cannot accumulate one in my life. So it shows that the national anthem is a good national anthem for 80% of Israel's population and for another equal amount of Jews outside Israel. Well, something is missing here. The 20% Arab population that needs a national anthem. Whose anthem should I sing? Whose responsibility is it? The state has to mature to become an Israeli state and not just a Jewish state. And that's what it's not doing. The same thing with other elements. But that's the constitutional discourse. And I think it will probably take us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 generations to resolve it. I'm not that optimistic on that discourse, but I think it should be on the table and it should be talked about. But it should be talked about not as a conditional. If it's not done today, we break society. We need to try to formulate success stories and islands of success that might have a tectonic capacity to actually bring a new generation that can deal with these issues much, much faster. I don't think that today it's easy to deal with those kind of issues. To talk about the national flag today in Israel, if I come and I say, I want to change that flag, and I want to change that flag, I probably will be disowned from all of the forums that are willing to even accommodate any dialogue with the Arab citizens. So the third area, we talked about the coexistence, which is the social contact theory. We talked about the narrative debate. The third area that I think we can accumulate some successes is on mutual interests, in economic integration, in some educational exchange type of programs. I've led a number of programs, including integrating Arab teachers in Jewish schools and Jewish teachers in Arab schools, and the results are phenomenal in reducing stereotypes, reducing fears, reducing racism. And a Jewish child that has an Arab teacher, after 2 years, their racism rate drops from 60% to somewhere around 10%. An Arab child with a Jewish teacher after 2 years, their racism rate drops from 52% to somewhere around 8%. So there are pills against racism. These are social educational programs that need to cross those tribes and in a way that we challenge the segregated reality that we have in Israel. Another one last comment. We cannot talk about a shared society without equality. Again, back to the horse and rider. I don't want to have a wonderful joint celebration of music and singing peace. And at the end of the day, the horse goes to the barn and eats hay, and the rider goes to his castle and eats a steak. So redistribution of power and the resources has also to be put on the table. The Arab citizens in Israel, and today we constitute almost 20% of the population, but have only 2.5% of the land. We have a jurisdiction of municipal jurisdiction on 2.5% of the land in Israel. That is not sufficient to build a proper growth in society. So redistribution of the national resources and the wealth has also to come in this direction. And there are a lot of areas in the economic arena where we can actually accomplish those successes. One of them in the medical arena. 23% of the doctors in Israeli hospitals today are Palestinian Arab citizens. And that's a place where Israeli Jews, because of their need for Arab doctors, they're willing to accept an Arab with a knife that cuts their stomach to treat them. It reduces their level of fear because of the interest factor. And we need to create more and more of those kind of islands of success to build a proper society.
Thank you. Before we turn to the audience, last but definitely not least, Yehuda, we just heard the need for some kind of common understanding, and Stav pointed to a politics that she envisions of a common cause. Can this be done now? To quote someone from earlier today, should a constitution be written for Israel today among its groups?
Yeah, well, I mean, about the constitutions, as I, earlier in our, just to clue in all of our friends who are gathered here, earlier in our discussion today, I made a vigorous case against Israel. Even though I'm a constitution worshiper in many ways, I made a vigorous case, convincing at least to myself, maybe to some others, against Israel trying to adopt a written constitution, simply because I think that, two things. One, the specific trade-offs that would have to be made, especially to the chief rabbinate on matters of personal status, et cetera, are to me intolerable, and would be a cause, as we say, b'chia l'dorot, a cause of weeping for generations. And second, something I didn't get into there, but that was at the present historical moment, once upon a time might have been different, the absence currently of a shared consensus. Now, speaking to the issue of consensus. Consensus for what and to what ends, a Jewish state to what ends. So a few comments. One, a few years ago I was in a discussion, a seminar, where a colleague of mine, a philosopher named Yotam Ben Ziman, made a marvelous observation. People bandy about, should Israel be a state of all of its citizens or not a state of all of its citizens? And he said, of course, every democracy is a state of all of its citizens. By definition, a democracy must be a state of all its citizens. The question is it the state of all its nationalities? And all the nationalities represented therein. Which means that fundamentals of citizenship and of an individual's relationship to the state, qua citizen, being mediated through law, that in some sense is the same for all, is essential to Israel's self-understanding as a democracy, and not just in an abstract philosophical principle, but also when we think of democracy as a way of managing disputes, of enabling disparate groups of people to live together. Now, how did we get ourselves into this? I think it's worth recalling that the State of Israel was created. Zionism, the Zionist movement, arose to answer what in late 19th century Europe had come to be called the Jewish question, the Jewish problem. And as Chad Ha'am, the great early Zionist thinker, penetratingly put it in an essay in 1897, he said that the problem of Judaism was really the Jewish problem was two questions: the problem of the Jews and the problem of Judaism. How do you secure Jewish social, political, economic well-being in the circumstances of the modern world? And how do you answer the collapse of traditional Jewish life and structures and the fragmentation and disorientation of Jewish identity? Interestingly, he was writing that as a criticism of political Zionism, which he thought had perhaps an answer to the first problem. He wasn't so sure, and was convinced that on its own terms had no answer to the second. Now, what that means, though, is that the Zionist movement went about building two things: state and community. So much of what we see in Israel arises, so many of the difficulties and the perplexities arises out of this combination and sometimes conflation and sometimes confusion of where the state and its system of laws, which by definition as in a democracy must be equal to all, meshes with community, right? Who's about sort of this kind of chosen, meaningful belonging. Now, the State of Israel was largely built by the labor Zionist movement. I mean, they emerged in the period after World War I as the dominant force in building the state for all kinds of reasons. But one of the reasons that labor Zionism emerged triumphant was that it created a kind of civic ethos. It created a new interpretation of Jewish history, a new interpretation of Jewish identity that was extremely compelling, an interpretation of Jewish identity which managed to synthesize the particular and the universal with its emphasis on social justice and seeing itself as an extension of the workers' movement around the world, and a powerful reinterpretation of Jewish history, symbols, and so on. That centralizing civic ethos has been in decline since the 1970s. Really starting with the Yom Kippur War. And the meta story of Israel in these recent decades has been the decline of the central civic ethos, culture, because the Labor Party was not just a party. It was a culture. It was a small civilization. And its decline and corresponding rise of groups that were marginalized, that either were marginal under labor, which is to say religious Zionists, Sephardic Jews, revisionist Zionists, or simply were not on the political stage, like namely the Russians, the people from the former Soviet Union who came to Israel in such large numbers. And so I think that part of the leadership failure that Stav talks about very powerfully is precisely resulting, in part, from the eclipse of the civic faith of labor Zionism and the difficulties it has in resurrecting itself. Right? I know something that I remember in my own involvement, right? I was living in Israel 2002, 2012. I was very active in civic issues in Jerusalem, particular issues having to do with gender segregation in the public sphere. And one of the things that was really hard for me and my colleagues was what a hard time we had in engaging secular activists to take part with us and to get them, and secular elites, to get interested in this issue because they didn't care. And it was sort of this sense, this is a microcosm of a larger phenomenon. Well, let the religious people run things in their neighborhoods, because then you get off the hook from having to deal with your own Jewishness. Now, I do have to say, one point that I do want to make, on the one hand, I'm in profound sympathy with everything that's been said here on the panel. I have to say, though, that in terms of how we understand the conflict and the conflict of Israel with the Palestinians across the Green Line, I do believe that the Palestinian Authority and certainly Hamas have responsibility of their own for the hardening of some Israeli attitudes and the destruction of the Israeli left. I just want to be very clear about that. I don't think that's the whole story, but I think it's a part of the story that has to be said. I know we're short on time, just want to make two last points. We see, well, really, 2 points. One, we're living, not just in Israel, we're living today in a period of liberal recession. Liberalism is in recession all over. It was in recession in Europe for the last 2 years, and now it's in recession in the United States. Admittedly, a few thousand votes in Wisconsin, Michigan, et cetera, things might have gone differently, but the sentiments that are driving the liberal recession in the United States, and also shenanigans with the Voting Rights Act, et cetera, played no small role here. But the sentiments driving the liberal recession in the United States are part of this. Part of the liberal recession is the decline of secular nationalism. It's the decline in the power of secular nationalism and its replacement by combinations of ethnicity with religion, right? Now, I don't know. On the one hand, I deeply resonate with what Shibli was saying about if you want to, by bringing religion into things, we muddy the waters and we bring in sets of concerns and issues that make it harder to effectuate certain kinds of forms of conflict resolution. On the other hand, entirely banishing the transcendent, the sphere of ultimate values, especially as it has been understood and interpreted over time, leaves liberals defenseless. Because believe me, the foes of liberal have lots of visions of ultimacy on their side. And the very last comment I'll make
Very briefly, please.
is that nothing is inevitable. The triumph of liberalism is not inevitable, but the worldwide defeat of liberalism, including the State of Israel, is not inevitable either, because it is all what we choose to make of it.
Thank you. So now we're going to do a special Brookings thing, which is the lightning round. And I'm going to collect 3 questions, but they have to be, please, questions. They end in a question mark. Please recognize yourself or present yourself briefly. And then I'm going to ask the panel in succession to answer very briefly, because in 12 minutes we're going to yield the floor to the next panel. The gentleman right here.
Thank you very much. I'm a member for UNESCO Task Force since 2000. And when you talk about tribes, what do you think of Jewish Christians in Israel, Arab Christians in Israel, and Druze in Israel? What is their influence? How do you integrate them in your thinking?
Thank you. Do we have the gentleman there, right there?
Hi, thank you. Thad Aburas from the University of Maryland and a Palestinian citizen from Israel. My question is to all of you, but it's in response to M.K. Shafir, especially that we're from the same generation. I got to admit that the rosy picture you tried to show is, at least the way I see it, is incomplete. Think about it this way. If in 1952, when Israel was constituted out of 80% secular Ashkenazis, we were unable to reach a constitution. And the reason we were unable to reach a constitution is because there's no agreement amongst the Jewish community in Israel what it means to be Jewish. So now if we are 4 different tribes that are demographically divided equally, how exactly will we be able to overcome our problems given the recommendations you gave earlier, which is basically to continue the situation, or that eventually this new generation will morph into something better. So the question to all of you basically is, what are your recommendations? How exactly can we change the reality in Israel so it could be a shared society, as Mr. Daraushi said, a true shared society?
Thank you. And the last question, all the way in the back, the gentleman standing.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz. The Peel Commission report, which in 1937 first proposed partition, gave as their reason the claim that the Jewish, which at the time was strictly secular Ashkenazi culture, and the Arab culture were incompatible, and that if the two were forced to mix, the Jewish culture would dominate the Arab culture, and they tried to separate them so that that wouldn't happen. The U.S. model has been the melting pot, where each nationality came in.
Please.
The question will be there.
Question now, please. Sorry.
Question now, can a democracy survive when you've got multiple competing cultures that refuse to make any kind of allowances for each other?
Very brief answers, please. And we're going to start with Shibli. If there's anything you want to respond, we'll move back. Thank you. Mohammed?
Yes. Well, the question about Christian and Druze Arabs, from my point of view, they are part of the Arab community. There's no question. It's not a question. I do not see them as separate in any different form. They have their own individual or sometimes even collective religious uniqueness. But in my personal social circles, I do not see any unique aspect to it. And the same thing also in the political arena in the Arab community. The Christian community is very significantly integrated. The Druze community is more separate in their political behavior. Almost 80%, 88% of the Arab citizens voted for the joint list, but that's the Christian and Muslim. But in the Druze community, almost 80% of them voted for Zionist political parties. So the political behavior is different, but the cultural behavior is very, very similar. Regarding what do we need to change, Thair's question, I think that what we need to change is the dominant government in Israel. The current government, which has been in power with different kind of coalitions since the last 7 years, in my view, is destroying any real chance for, connecting to the last question, for maintaining democracy. Democracy is eroding in Israel as we speak. It's shrinking towards the Arab community, but ultimately it ends up shrinking towards other populations in Israeli society. And I think that we need to try to save it as fast as we can. I don't think that grassroots, bottom-up work is sufficient and enough. It's important, needs to be done on a daily basis. This is what I do for a living. You know, I'm getting my hands in the real field, child by child, but that's not enough. It's not just bottom-up. It has to be top-down kind of change with alternative leadership to the State of Israel that takes it into the correct direction. I don't want to use that term right direction because the term right is problematic these days. And I think that it cannot, you know, and here I have just to relate also to the two top findings that Shibli presented in his the two pies. I do think that many of the issues are connected with the regional context, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We need to find a quick resolution. And Yehuda, I really totally disliked your comment about blaming the Palestinians. I mean, this is a blame game that one is not to be presented here. This is not the topic. And second, who cares who was the reason for the failures of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations? The failure, everyone is paying the price for that failure right now. And I think that at this stage, it's mainly Israel that can pick up the pieces and pull it together.
Thank you.
And I think that's it.
We have to yield the floor. I'm sorry.
All right.
I apologize. Yehuda, very briefly, please.
No, I mean, I just want to make it emphatically clear. I don't mean to lay blame on one side, but I think that these issues are dynamic. I think there's things that Palestinian leaders say that are not, say and do, that are not helpful. And I know that liberals like me and leftists like me in Israel who've tried to make arguments in Israeli society get knocked on the head with all kinds of things, okay? So that's what I'm getting at. I know blame games are entirely unproductive because there's plenty of blame to go around, needless to say. And yes, I mean, we understand who are the people who have responsibility to move things forward, but I think that has to be recognized as well.
Thank you. And finally, MK Shafir, briefly.
Let me just comment on that, just one.
Very briefly.
And
Actually,
sorry.
I'm sorry. We're gonna have many panels on the conflict. We're gonna table that issue, and we're gonna come back to that on many panels on this. Sorry, MK Shafir, please.
Thank you. Well, as to your question, it's not a rosy picture that it's not a rosy reality. I'm trying to be pragmatic about a very unrosy reality. The situation today in Israel is, and that connection between the different tribes is on decline. We need to change that if we want to have a future for our country. It's not a rosy picture because we're talking about not just about different tribes, we're talking about populations that are in conflict, also inside Israel. People of our generation who lived from one intifada to another, with who experienced terrorism and experienced in our day-to-day lives that ongoing fear. We need to end this. We need to solve it, but we should not ignore fear while we do that. How do we do it? First of all, that it's not just an economic story. It's the first thing that has to be changed in order for us to start and unite that society into an Israeli society that is strong and equal, is an end to the conflict. The conflict is, first of all, puts more and more barriers between the society, not just between Jews and Arabs, but also inside the Jewish community. The lack of ability of the government to explain its non-solution to the conflict, to explain why they're not doing everything that within their power to go for a two-state solution as fast and as efficiently as possible, they don't have security-based arguments to that, because we all know that a continuation of the conflict or an annexation of the West Bank will not bring to more security. It will damage our security severely and will cause a lot of harm to our society. But the lack of ability of the right today in Israel to explain that continuation of the status quo from a security point of view gets them to try to change the field of that discourse from a security field to a religious field. It's not about security anymore. It's just religion. It's a religious belief. You need to have faith in that, and that would solve our problems. Now, that's a whole different field. It's a legitimate field, but it's not the field in which we're talking about the conflict and about solutions to the conflict. We have to go back to the security field in order to, and the national field in order to end it. How do we do this? We have to aim, as again, a progressive camp, for an equal budget for our education system, to give, that's the first priority. Education is the strategy, to give people the ability to fulfill their potentials, to become more integrated within the job market, to become more independent, and to live their lives peacefully and with financial security. We need to do much more in terms of policy, not just in the third sector, but in our policy to create more integration. Today, a Jewish and an Arab child will never meet in school, in most cases. Also not a secular and an ultra-Orthodox kid. They would just never meet, sometimes ever, even in their adult lives. We have to put much more energy into integration within the education system, within the job market, in the public sector. And the third thing and the last thing, and that's for our generation, we have to start and push our generation into politics and into the public sector. If we want to see changes, if we want to take our strengths, which are technology, our perception of society that has changed thanks to social networks and thanks to the internet and thanks to our much greater access to information and to knowledge, if we want to bring all of that forward and create a much more shared society, we have to get our generation to participate more in politics, in the public sector, to fight corruption and to fight that sectarian politics that doesn't serve us and will not serve our future.
Thank you very much. And my apologies to the panelists for cutting everyone short among the last 2 days, and now very happily yielding the floor to Leon Wieseltier in our next panel.